Hey, welcome to the Elle Russ Show, where we explore ways to get healthy, wealthy, and wise. With a combination of guest interviews and solo episodes, I hope you will be inspired and motivated to become the best of whatever you are. I'm Elle Russ, #1 best-selling author and subject expert with over a decade of helping thousands of people across the globe. Visit my website, elleruss.com, to learn more about free guides, masterclasses, online courses, and more. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, today we have somewhat of a maverick, a real trailblazer in this world, Shelly Tygielski. She's the author of Sit Down to Rise Up, How Radical Self-Care Can Change the World. She is the founder of the global grassroots mutual aid organization, which we'll talk a little bit about, called Pandemicoflove. Love that title. And her work has been featured by over 100 media outlets, including CNN Heroes, The Kelly Clarkson Show, CBS This Morning, so much more. She is a trauma-informed mindfulness teacher and a Garrison Institute Fellow, and she has been called one of the 12 most powerful women of the Mindfulness Movement by mindful.org, and she teaches self-care and resiliency at organizations around the world. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
So I know you have a little condensed version on your website, but I'd like you to rip through how you got here. I know you spent decades climbing the corporate ladder, and now you've turned that into pragmatic lessons learned from there into a mindfulness meditation and, of course, global aid, which we're going to get into that in a minute. But give us your rundown.
I, like many people, especially people who are type A personalities and who have always been overachievers and people pleasers, had a very goal-oriented life. And my goal was to achieve titles and pedigree and degrees and to, get to a place where I thought, when I can get this, when I can get to that place, when I can achieve this thing or this recognition, I will be happy. I will be fulfilled. I will have, reached the top of the mountain, so to speak. And what happened was that, you climb this proverbial mountain, and when you reach the top of that mountain and you think, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to really enjoy the view and take it all in, or perhaps, I'm going to meet that great guru that has the big, long white beard, that's going to basically tell me the meaning of life or congratulate me for achieving all of these things. I actually wound up being confronted with a lot of emptiness. And when I got to the top of that mountain, when I got to, the degrees, the working for the big 5 companies, the Fortune 500 companies, the titles, the running up the corporate ladder, being the only woman in the room, and eventually being the CEO of a company with 2,400 employees, I actually felt the most miserable and the most empty that I'd ever felt in my life. And I started having incredible just really intense panic attacks, having major anxiety as a person who really never experienced anxiety in my life, at least not at that level. It really started to disrupt my way of thinking, my way of being, my way of showing up in the world. And it also really affected my ability to be happy and to tap into joy. And so I really had to not look for that guru on top of the mountain, but I like to call it a uru. Like it's basically looking within, realizing that when you get to the top of that mountain, the only thing that's there besides the view maybe is a mirror, and you're finally confronted with yourself. And I think sometimes that can be even scarier than being confronted by many other things.
Yeah, when you talk about like climbing that mountain, I think of I'm a fan of I'm not an ice climber or mountain climber. You're never going to see me do it, but I love watching the documentaries of some of the like mountain disasters because there's always a disaster. But in it is always sort of this like one story that pops out is the woman that wanted to do all the set like famous seven summits and she like did all of them except for Everest. She's like just above the summit, but they ran out of oxygen. They're like, look, we got to turn around. She's like, no, I got to get that photo at the top. And she died. You know? And so if that's not a metaphor for people getting burned out early, I was disabled from the workforce, the corporate world at the age of 23, just pushing it hard, right? So it's not just physically taxing, but emotionally taxing. And then also like, what are those benchmarks? What are those seven summits if like you're pursuing them for what? Potentially, I
Right.
mean, death is extreme. Obviously, I'm just making that reference,
Sure.
but yeah, so
Well,
it's an empty place. And also I'm sure in that day to day, it was like, "Oh my gosh, is this all there is?" Right? Like, is this just
right.
my gonna be my day in and day out? So, at what point were you like, "All right, I mean, something has to shift." How did you do something different caught in
Yeah.
that?
Well, a couple of things happened. But first of all, you say death is an extreme, but aren't we all just like dying a little bit each day?
Yes,
So
we are. We're
it is an extreme,
actively
but
dying right now.
yeah, but I actually think that like we don't, we kind of don't think about that until obviously something really horrific
Yes.
happens. And so yeah, I started having the panic attacks and my husband, my friends were all saying to me like something's got to change. Like you can't keep doing this. You have to change something.
That's great
And it
friends.
seemed yeah, it seems like great advice, but from a practical perspective, and I think, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners that can relate, you have responsibilities, you have obligations. There are people in your life that you can't disappoint, right? You've got a mortgage to pay, you have a kid in private school, you've got parents that maybe are, um, wanting to, or need your support, right? Aging parents, etc. So, um, it's a challenge in that sense, that you can't just sort of rip the Band-Aid off and say, well, you know what, I'm independently wealthy and I'm not happy, so I'm just gonna carry on with my life. That's not true for most, I would say, of the population that might be going through something like this. And so I really had to just think about because I am a good planner, so I'll give myself that accolade, right? I had to really sit down and plan for um for there to be the right moment for me to do this. That didn't seem like it was going to be a million years away or something that I just kept pushing off to tomorrow and procrastinating. And so a few things happened. One thing was that I had a friend at the time who was incredibly supportive and invited me to almost like an intervention brunch. She basically
An
invited my
interven brunch. I would need a word for that. That's
yeah,
fantastic.
totally. Um and she basically was like, I would complain to her nonstop about how miserable I was and she finally said, "Look, I like let me understand." She was in a position, she was the owner, the CEO of a company and not in my industry, nothing to do with like anything that I would, have thought that I would be suited to like work for or at. But she essentially said, "Look, let me just be your safety net. If you are basically saying that the reason that you can't do this is because if you don't succeed within a window of 6 months doing something else that you're really passionate about, then I will hire you. I won't be able to hire you for the same amount of money that you're making today, but at the very least, like, that you have this like plan B, this backup plan." So one, I had that, sort of like in the back of my mind, knowing that there was like this safety net, even if was one that I wouldn't necessarily want to take. Right.
Sure.
And that was very helpful, being able to have that conversation. But the second thing that she kind of mandated and made me do was she said, write a resignation letter and date it. I don't care when you date it for. Date it for 6 months from now, from 4 months from now, for 3, but write it so that it's real and it's tangible and it's something that is like, okay, I'm doing this and I have this deadline. And she's like, and if by that deadline you don't actually turn in that resignation letter, then you have no right to complain to me again about like the situation that you're in. So that was really sound advice. And I actually have used that advice and told that advice to other people because I
Yeah,
think
same.
that,
That's my jam right there. Is I have a thing where it's like, listen, I had someone who came to me every year, and it was like for 3 years in a row, once a year, they were gonna like lose weight, quit drinking, all the things. And of course, they overdid it, right? They're like, I'm gonna join a boot camp and then do a YouTube video. I mean, like you're like, it's just it's never gonna work out. So finally, like I think it was the third time, I said, hey, look, um, from here on out, it's happened 3 times. Like you have no longer have the right to bitch to me about it. You can go to anyone else you want, but you can't talk to me about it until you actually start doing something meaningful about it because, like I'm done hearing about it. And sometimes that kind of tough love and friendship
yeah,
is it can really work and it is important. And at the very minimum, your friend isn't suffering with hearing this thing over and over again that their friend's not doing something about, right? So I
yeah,
do appreciate that a lot. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, that it was really sound advice and it was incredibly tangible. The other thing that happened was that, it's it's like from the mouth of babes, basically. My son actually was in middle school at the time, going through his own existential crises on a daily basis at that age. And I was kind of bringing home the misery every day because
Mm.
I was stuck in traffic or I got home late or there was an accident on the highway or and then you can probably relate. You get home and you open the door and one of the first questions is like, "What's for dinner?" And you're just like, "Ah, I can't deal with this like simple question."
Yeah.
And so, he basically looked at me one day and after I had kind of had a rough day and brought it all home and said, "You know what the best day of my life is going to be?" And I thought he was going to say, "The day I get out of this house." And he basically, but he said, "The day you quit your damn job
Yeah.
and take your own advice." And I was like, wow, okay. So, that was kind of like a stark reminder to me too that we're being watched, and that I have to practice what I preach and
Mm.
actually start to walk the walk because I'm so good at giving other people advice, but we're also, and I know people can relate, you're bad at taking your own advice when it comes to stuff like that. So that was like the second piece. And then the
Yeah.
third thing I would say really, is that I feel like in a way, I finally started to listen to my own gut and to my own kind of intuition and shift from being a goal oriented person. And I talk about this in my book to being a person that's really centered around intentions. And there's a very big difference between the two.
Oh, yeah.
And right. And so again, my whole life was really centered around how do I become the CEO of this thing? Or how do I, um, you know, get this promotion or make this much money or have this car? And it's like, suddenly being so miserable, you start to kind of think like, why do I feel this way? I finally have everything I've ever kind of worked for and wanted on paper. And yet I feel incredibly down and incredibly empty. And like you said, is asking
Because
myself
paper
constantly,
isn't
is
the
this as
feeling,
good
is
as
it?
it gets? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's like the paper. God, that street cred, that like thing, I get it because I get the comment too about like my resume and things like that. Oh, you did that, and you're like, yeah, yeah, it's true. And actually, a lot of it was awesome, and I'm happy about it. But it still doesn't denote happiness. It doesn't denote the feeling.
Yeah.
You can't almost imagine sometimes if you've never been in the corporate environment and you want to be a CEO and that's a goal, you almost can't imagine what that would feel like. You think you do, but then you're there and it might change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a scary thing too, is being able to shift, being able to pivot, being able to go and be more intentional and less goal oriented or intentional about the goals, right? But you mentioned that, so I want to just dive in. So,
Mm-hmm.
what then? The intention comes from what? I'm assuming imagining and feeling the feelings you
Yeah.
would like to have in the future versus having it attached to a specific.
Well, I started thinking about really deeply about like why I feel so miserable. Why do I feel so alone? Why am I having these panic attacks? And like ultimately, a lot of it came down to the fact that I was really missing connection and community. I'm a very
Yeah.
gregarious person who, you know, loves to kind of feel like I am part of the communal fabric. And obviously that leads into a lot of my work with Pandemic of Love and what I'm doing today. But like, it was something that I just kind of had to really sit back and say, like, what's missing from my life in this moment? But like, not things, right? But like, what is actually missing from my life? And there's a saying which is true and it's so cliche, but people always say like it's lonely at the top. And it's true. Like if you are the CEO of a company, oftentimes if you're not surrounded by like other CEOs or other people that are kind of like in that same position, or make it a point to at least have like a peer group that you're consistently in touch with outside of your office, it can be a very isolating position to be in because everybody wants a piece of you, right? And all the pressure is
Yep.
like mounting on you to deliver. And everybody's always looking at you for the answers. And so what ultimately started happening was because I was working and so hard and had such a long commute and, was constantly traveling and trying to, as many people and especially, women and moms do, try to be everything to everybody, show up for all your kids' stuff, be there for your parents, be there for, every obligation. I basically just put myself last. And I realized that I needed to reconnect both with myself, but also with a community. So I started to take some time on Sunday mornings, which was really the only time I could find, like early in the morning, 8:00, 8:30 in the morning. I lived in South Florida, was really close to the ocean. And I started to go to the beach to just think about these things and to meditate and to just get quiet and have a moment to myself that I could carve out during the week where there wasn't chatter, there wasn't a phone, there weren't emails, there wasn't anybody asking me for anything, but I could just like really hear myself think and get quiet. And what happens is that when you get quiet, things actually get really loud if you're willing to listen to them. And
I
what
want to
I,
I want
yeah,
to stop you right there and say I love this so much because obviously that's a self-care move. But whatever it is for someone else, the forest, a park, whatever their thing is, I love this because it's just one thing that you've changed. Like you're at this moment, right? You're like, okay, you
mhm,
know what? This is the one, and I'm so for that. First of all, I'm a big fan of the beach and what that can do, but nature in general, right? And what we
yeah,
already know scientifically about what it can do for your mood, your health, your immunity. So to be able to get out in any way that you can, but I love that it's just one small thing, and you're so right.
right.
I would go to the beach, a specific beach actually, I just felt a connection with for like answers. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like because
totally.
when I went there, so I love that. That's just one small thing you dedicated yourself to that is not high exertion. It's very chill. So
Correct.
love that. And I just
Yeah,
want
and doable, super
to
doable,
doable.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was totally doable, and it didn't feel like it was, one more thing to put on my list that's gonna be completely overwhelming, but actually felt like something that would, fill my vessel and didn't require, like, a lot of energy or time on my part, which I like, had none of either to give at that point. And
What did the beach do for you? What did these beach trips
well, the
reveal to you?
beach, on a wider level, it changed the trajectory of my life. Because what became really audible to me when I started to really like just listen and tap in is that I was really missing community and connection. And so I was thinking, okay, so other than adding more stuff to my calendar, like going to dinner 4 nights a week with friends or, having to go out and spend more money. And again, trying to carve out time that I didn't have that would just stress me out and yet feel like another obligation. How do I get connection? How do I find this community? So I decided to post on at the time my Facebook page, and I just put up a post that said, "I'm meditating on Sunday mornings at the beach. This is the beach. Who wants to join me next week? Like, I'm happy to do a guided meditation and walk people through it if you've never meditated before." And I had no idea what would happen when I hit send, but I hit send.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing because, a dozen or so people, some that were really good friends that I knew, and some that were, you have a cadre of Facebook friends that are sort of acquaintances or people that you don't know as well. And the next Sunday, 12 people showed up to the beach. And it was a blustery, windy, not ideal type of a morning, but people showed up anyway. And the fact that we were able to just sit in these really non-ideal conditions, and meditate and talk and connect was something that I think was so refreshing to everyone at that time. And this was in 2015. So this was like November of 2015. Well, we decided as a group that, hey, this was really nice. We should do this again. And so we started to show up on Sunday mornings thereafter. First, I think it was every other Sunday, and then it became every Sunday. And a few months, into this whole kind of experiment, if you will, that again, I had no goals for it. It wasn't like I set out to say, like, oh, I want to start a meditation community. I'm going to do this because that's the normal Shelly way. That's the way that I
Well,
normally
that's the
do.
goal way, isn't it? Right?
Yes. But I was just like, this is really nice. And, it's really feeding
Well,
my
the
soul. And
intention, right? The
yeah.
intention.
Yep.
It's not, I just want to bring the audience back to that because your intention was like community connection. So you were
Yep.
just doing it out of that intention. It
Yeah.
turned into something way greater. But even if that had been the end goal, right? It's just such a
Yeah.
different approach. Yeah.
It's a totally different approach. And so, um, what happened was really mind blowing. It's that the community grew from like the 12 people to 30 people to then 50 to 100 to, 1,000 people gathering on the beach meditating, and to eventually a community that met almost every week out of the year for 5 straight years until the pandemic like shut everything down. And, um, it was a free gathering for all people, like across every perceived divide that you can imagine. And people were just there all for the same intention and the same reason. And something continued to draw people there week after week after week. And they were able to also find community. And I would say, in many cases, unlikely community, because it was normally people that would connect with individuals that they would otherwise maybe never interact with otherwise in their bubbles that they live in or in their circles of influence or friendship. So I accidentally built this community. Um, and I was still, by the way, working full time at this point. So what was happening is that on Sundays mornings, I was feeling really great. I was feeling like I'm aligned with my highest intention and my purpose, feeling really soulful and wonderful. And then as Sunday night would creep in,
Hmm.
I would have that looming dread of like, oh, tomorrow's Monday. I have to go into the office. I have to commute. I have to start it all over again. And that's when the panic attacks really started, right?
Can I just throw out that
Yeah.
like Sundays when you're in that environment and I know are just downers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then it's so interesting that because now in my life, as I have not worked that that corporate thing for so long, it's such a nice thing to change, but it lingered for a while. Where even
Yeah,
though I didn't have to be somewhere Monday, I would be down, I would be bummed out on
totally.
Sunday. And same with
Yeah.
Ashley's school, like the back to school time. I'd be like, no, back to school, winter. But then I'd be like, wait, you live in California, you're out of school. Like you don't have to worry about this. You've been out of school for years. But yeah, that
Yeah.
feeling of Sundays. And that's why, shocker, majority of heart attacks happen on Mondays.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Yep.
Hmm. Oh my
So
goodness.
sorry, yeah, the Sunday dread, and then my God, I mean, your Sundays were great, but then the dread Sunday night of Monday.
Yeah, totally. And that would just creep in and set in. And so the convergence of all those things, right? My brunch intervention, my son uh uh, watching me with his watchful eyes, and then and calling me out, and then this kind of parallel path that is kind of growing and happening inadvertently, and really kind of fueling me and feeding me um on a weekly basis. So this community continued to grow, and by by May of 2016, we had thousands of people that were gathering. In fact, the city of Hollywood at the time had to come and shut us down because, and we eventually worked with them and it was fine. They were great to work with, but like they were so worried that we were taking up literally not wall to wall, but like sand to sand from the beach, the dune to the shore. And people, emergency vehicles couldn't get through. And people were just like, they wanted to make sure that it was not a paid event because I didn't have a permit. And so they actually wound up working with us and allowing us to continue to gather since it was free and open to all. And, there was never a barrier to entry from that perspective, but we just worked with them to bring cones out and, make sure that we were being really good citizens as well. But that kept happening. And so ultimately what resulted as well from those gatherings was that people were coming up to me after the meditations and would want to give me a hug and talk to me. And then people would start asking me if I could come to their classroom or come to their corporation or, do I do public speaking or would I be, a life coach or, all sorts of these different opportunities would crop up. And I would literally look at people and say, like, what are you talking about? Like, this isn't my job. I have a job. Like, I'm the CEO of you know what I mean? Like, I still, at that point, was so still resistant.
Yeah, it's the
And I
reluctant
think,
coach. Yeah, no, it's the thing.
yeah, I
For
was
sure.
really
And it's
reluctant.
always people are always like, you should be a teacher. Usually people's like, oh no, I've never. And then you're like, that's who you are.
Yeah, no, totally. And it was like, but I think a really big part of it, and I want to point this out because it really has so much to do with like just our conditioning growing up and like also the way that we put so much weight on how what we do defines us, like our identity. It's such a big core part of our identity. And I remember like even a year after I had left the corporate world, right? And I was teaching and I had a book deal and I was like really like starting to make moves, if you will. Like I felt like, okay, like I'm really aligned with my mission and my purpose, my intention. And I would go to, let's say, a gathering where, whatever it was, a networking event, or if you're at a bar or at a wedding or a cocktail hour, or whatever, and somebody would say, "Oh, hey, I'm Bob. What do you, I'm an attorney. What's your name? What do you do?" And
Sounds
my response wasn't like, "I'm Shelly and I teach mindfulness," but rather, well, I used to be the CEO of blah, 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 blah. And then and I had to like
yep.
literally say a whole paragraph because I
You had
felt,
to you had to preface it and had to like excuse
yes,
it.
validate exactly because
Yes.
my validation was so like my self-validation was so
That's such a
deeply
good
tied
catch
to
there.
my title.
Such a good catch on yourself.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and I mean, I felt gross doing it, to be honest with you, like not to be like now I'm being self-judgmental too. So like that's a whole other thing. But like so but clearly I'm also self-aware, so that's a good thing. But like I just felt so um like why am I doing that? And I really just kind of started to catch that. And
And that's
and
mindfulness, isn't it?
yeah.
That's radical self-awareness,
Yeah.
you know? Um,
Yeah.
what a good catch. I always in my second book on confidence, I always talk about, truly confident people don't usually feel the need to over-explain, but we always get caught in that. But that over-explaining is over-justifying, right? It's this
Yeah.
justification we feel. I remember one summer I had decided where I was gonna just I was like, you know what? I'm actually gonna just do what everyone wishes they could do in my situation and like enjoy California beach. And I'm going to go hang out at the beach for like a couple, I'm actually going to do it.
Hmm.
Like I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And I remember people would be like, hey, what are you up to this summer or whatever? And this feeling the need to somehow say something, quote, legitimate. And I was just like, I would hold back and I would just go, you know what? I'm actually going to do nothing but work on my tan and like eat fruit and like hang out by the beach and like go to town on some ribs and like just enjoy life. I would just had no shame. I just was like, it was so weird to say it, but I was like, why not? Because I really had this whole thing with myself about why do I feel like I got to justify my
Right.
existence, my place, my time, anything. But it's a good thing to catch when you feel yourself in that over explaining mode, right? That over justification. That could be something that could catch a really great golden nugget, as they say, like you did.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you.
I
Um,
want I want to also just jump. There's so much to talk to you about because and I'll throw out a couple things later that maybe you can breeze through. Although they're very interesting parts of your life, but in this book and in general, just the idea of like radical self care.
mhm.
Um, what I love about the word radical and self care together is that I do like selfishness. I feel that's not a bad word, right? But there is this stigma of selfishness and how it's the connotation of that word. And there's a whole, there's a lot of levels there. There's also the industry and marketing and things that go on with this
Mhm.
as the industry of it. But aside from the industry of it, so many people feel guilty and bad for doing like me taking that summer, right? Or
Yeah.
right, or going, I should be doing this. But it's like, then what are y'all doing it for, right? And so
Right.
self-care, like you going to the beach. So talk about that and selfishness and how can one reckon that and sort that out in their heads if they're feeling that way about it, and that's why they really haven't done it.
Yeah, I mean, I really do dig into this deeply in the book, and I also call out the fact that we really shouldn't be calling self-care self-care, but rather, we should petition to change it to communal care because it's self-care and then just the term self, it does imply obviously the I and the me and like doesn't actually allow for the communal nature of what self-care actually is. Like it requires all of us, even if I'm taking time for myself, somebody needs to pick up my son from school or somebody might need to, you know, kind of cover for me for those 15 minutes or there's just so many different aspects to why self-care is communal. So I just wanted to point that out first because I think that that's really incredibly important and just to help people reframe what self-care can actually be, that it can really be part of communal existence. And so when you kind of start to think about things in that way, you realize that number one, self-care is an act of self-preservation, which is a direct quote from Audre Lorde, who talked a lot about self-care and wrote a lot about it. And that when we can show up for ourselves, then we are able to show up in the world and for the people that we care about and for our community in a much more present, whole, and integrated way. And I think that when we start to experience what that actually means, I think cognitively many of us know that already. Like it makes sense. You're like, yeah, of course. Like if I'm going to put the proverbial, everybody always uses cliche, like oxygen mask on myself first, then I can help other people. And yes, that is true. But I think what ultimately happens as well is like we are better, more integrated, aware people when we take the time to just pause for a minute. And I think that people think that self care has to, number one, cost money, which it doesn't. And like you alluded to, right? There's the industrial wellness complex that exists, and people are trying to constantly sell us on things to assist and facilitate our self care. But the reality is that true self care does not cost money. And secondly, people think that it has to take a lot of time, and it doesn't. You can actually incorporate, and I talk about, just small best practices of how to incorporate moments into your day, these recalibration moments to be able to just take that, swig of oxygen and take that pause and be able to not walk into that house as I did when I walked in that day where my son, called me out with that residue from the day, but actually leave all of that residue as you would if you were walking in the snow or in the mud. You wouldn't drag all that mud into your home, right? You would have these mud rooms where you could like leave that residue in the mud rooms. And so I think that metaphorically, if we start to think about where in our lives and throughout our day can we like build these like proverbial mud rooms where we can leave all that residue behind or recalibrate or clean off and show up in a different way many moments at a time, as opposed to thinking of it as like this overwhelming task that's ahead. And when we start to frame it that way, it doesn't seem as selfish. It seems very much like it's coming from a place of self-preservation and of self-improvement.
There's so much to discuss. I want to just, in the last 15 minutes here or so, I want to jump into because you've been widely praised for being the founder of pandemicoflove, which you created shortly after COVID-19. That's sort of in segueing that from like the inside out, right? You
Yeah,
know what I mean? I love that. Can you just tell everyone a little bit about this mission and
sure.
this organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, Pandemic of Love is a perfect example of moving from the me to the we to the us, right? So go taking something from what you think is an individualistic pursuit of self-care to a communal pursuit of how can I help the greater good. And it really is a direct line in that during, if you take yourself back to March of 2020, when really the world didn't understand what COVID actually was. There wasn't enough PPE. There was a big panic. Things were shutting down. We didn't have, there was no talk about, a vaccine, let alone, a solution or kind of, it was a very scary time, right? If you could just put yourself back in that moment. And I think people were worried, obviously, about themselves and their livelihoods and their families and especially people who, had older parents and were immunocompromised or, could barely make ends meet to begin with. And I think in that moment, obviously I worried about myself and my family. I have an autoimmune condition. And so I was obviously incredibly worried about that. And what maybe getting COVID-19 would mean for me personally. But I was just genuinely worried about this meditation community that I had grown at that point and worried about the people that I knew were really suffering already and that were going to suffer more as a result of the pandemic. And so again sat down with myself, got really quiet in meditation, and I really started to think about the tangible ways that I could possibly help individuals that I care about. So I thought about, first and foremost, I thought about myself, almost like kind of like throwing a stone in a pond, right? Like creating that ripple effect. And so thought about myself. I first and foremost got in touch with my feelings. I wanted to label and identify my own emotions. What was I feeling in that moment? And obviously fear and apprehension and um stress and anxiety, a lot of different emotions came up for me. Being able to just identify them and kind of nurture myself was really helpful. And from that position of kind of feeling less, you know, triggered, if you will, by my emotions, right? And physiologically just being able to like calm myself down, I was able to think about not from a reactive mode, but from a responsive mode. Okay, so now I feel this way. I'm worried about these specific things. What can I do about them that's tangible? And so that's how I came up with the idea for Pandemic of Love, which is and was even at that moment and still is to this day incredibly simple. It's a simple idea that I didn't invent, by the way. Mutual aid has existed since the dawn of humanity, and I think now, especially with the LA wildfires and the Hurricane Helene that happened in Asheville, where I live, people are hearing more and more and more about mutual aid, and it's really becoming a term that people are starting to understand and starting to understand like why it's necessary for communities to build and weave safety nets and save each other. And so I really looked to my community of meditators at that point. We had probably about 15,000 people that were a part at one point or another of our community. And I started to think about a tangible way that I could start making connections between people who needed help, like in a tangible way, i.e., I need a laptop, I need my phone bill paid, I need a car bill paid, my mortgage, etc., to people who were able to give that help, who maybe were still fine working from home, didn't lose income, um, and maybe their life didn't materially, change in that moment. And so I just put up two really simple Google forms. Um, One was called Give Help and one was called Get Help. And it just asked like 5 or 6 really simple questions at that time. And I posted those two links on my social media pages. And I think I recorded like a 40-second, video that was incredibly short and to the point. And at the end, I said, that the virus isn't the only thing that is infectious, but that love can be infectious and hope can be infectious and altruism can be infectious. And so that's how Pandemic of Love was born. Again, out of an intention, right? An intention to help people. I didn't sit there, again, old Shelly would have sat there and whiteboarded this. And I would
Right.
have
Be
been
like,
like,
what
how do I
kind of
make sure to
money and
build?
salary
Yeah.
could I eventually make?
Or just like, how do I make sure I build this like app and this platform to help people to make sure that, and it like, there wasn't even a thought of that. It was like, people need help like now in this moment. Nobody's going to wait for somebody to build a website and
Yeah.
to get all the bugs out of it. How do we just like go back to the lowest common denominator of like what makes us human, which is empathy and connection? And how do we do that? And so I just thought, well, I could just connect people. So identify person A and what they need, person B who's willing to fill that need, connect them directly, and then just step out of the way and allow them to transact in whatever way makes sense for them at that moment, whether it's a phone call, a text message, somebody paying somebody's bill, whatever it was in that moment. And it was pretty remarkable to see that, within 24 hours, there were thousands of people that were willing to help and thousands of people who needed help. And so very quickly, Pandemic of Love grew into, this global grassroots volunteer led organization. To date, we've transacted over $200 million directly. We are not a nonprofit organization. We are a nonprofit disruptor. And what that means is that we don't have any overhead. We have no fees. We have no employees. Basically, the 350 chapters that exist in 21 countries of Pandemic of Love are all volunteer driven. It's all about micro communities and building communities that have safety nets and take into account that every person on this planet, regardless of their socioeconomic status, has something they can offer the world, and every person has something they need. And if we can communicate those things to each other in a really effective way and do so on a consistent basis, we can get to a kind of this place of homeostasis where people's needs can be met and filled and done in a way that feels really collaborative and really communal, as opposed to, living in a world where we constantly feel like we're on the run and we're competing with each other. And it's like survival of the fittest.
I know we don't have too much time left, and this is a big discussion. You cover it partially in your book, and it's goes way deeper than you could probably cover in a book. But you're no stranger to trauma, even in your bio, trauma-informed mindfulness teacher. You in Sit Down to Rise Up, you've got a crazy, incredible story of how you were kidnapped when you were 2 years old, and then you also talk about a struggle with a chronic autoimmune eye disease. Two things that you know, tough can hit at one's confidence, self-esteem, perhaps, ways of looking at the world. I know it's a such a huge topic, right? But tell us how those two things, in whatever way you'd like to express that, have changed your life for the better and things you might have had to overcome as a result.
You know, I always and I actually have this printed on a separate page in my book, because like the one quote that always comes to me, and it's my one of my favorite quotes by the poet Mary Oliver, and she says, "Once I was given a box of darkness, And it took me a while to figure out that it too was a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, when you are confronted with any form of trauma, even and I've worked with people who have lost their children to mass shootings, to gun violence, which is the worst thing I could ever think of. And when you work with people who have been confronted with trauma, or you yourself have been confronted with trauma, you realize, and we go back to, actually, it's really great because it's a full circle kind of conversation here. We talk about how you identify yourself, right? What is that identity that you have as a person? And you have this moment, this kind of fork in the road at some point. And for some people it happens earlier, and for some people it happens later, and maybe for some it just never happens because they're not willing to walk down that path. But I've seen it happen, and it certainly has happened with me, where I have this moment of realization that the trauma can make me be this bitter person and be what identifies me for the rest of my life and labels me as, this person that has this disease, or this person that, had this traumatic event happen to them. Or I could use that as a tool to sort of propel me and, again, bring me back to my intention, which is connection, and allow me to create safe spaces and be vulnerable, and allow me to share my pain, and allowing me to share my experiences to help ease the pain and be the salve to the wounds of other people. And so, as a trauma-informed mindfulness teacher, what that essentially means is that, I mean, if I boil it down, we can totally have an entire conversation about this. But ultimately, it has really to do with restoring choice back to people. I think that that's the kind of the through line for anything that is trauma informed. Because what happens is that when a trauma happens to you, it's not your choice, right? You feel like in that moment the rug's been pulled out from under you in
It's
every
happening
which
to
way.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's happening to you. I had no choice. And so suddenly, to, you know, even in a situation where somebody's trying to help you and tells you to close your eyes, take a deep breath, visualize this and visualize that. And, the person may be definitely trying to help you kind of get to a better place, if you will, in that moment, but is removing the choice, that you have, the autonomy, the um, you know, the ability to basically say, I don't want to close my eyes. Like I'm making the decision as to like how I want to take this journey. And so, that's a big part of the training. And there's obviously so many more components, but I just, wanted to kind of voice that because I think that a lot of times people think that, people who have gone through something traumatic, that there's sort of like this timeline or this expiration to it. And it's actually just something that you eventually, it just becomes a part of who you are and a part of your life, but it doesn't define you. So for me, for example, right, you mentioned my autoimmune condition with my eyes. I have been struggling with that since I was 27. I was diagnosed with a disease. I was told that I would be blind by the time I was 40. And I'm 47 now, and I am blind in my left eye. I'm visually impaired there, and I'm really struggling and having a lot of issues in my right eye. And there could be this kind of end of the road moment, right? And certainly it hasn't been a walk in the park. And I go through these ups and downs emotionally, but having the tools and the ability to sort of choose the outcome for myself and how, again, I want to show up for myself and how I want to show up for others, and allow myself to, if I need to, wallow in self-pity for that moment without feeling guilt or shame, but knowing that I have the tools and the capacity and now the community that can help me move on from that.
Yeah, not simmering too long. I always talk about that from an ancestral perspective that, they didn't having a victim mindset would have been a recipe for death back then. It had to be onward and upward. Failures were just literally only feedback. Doesn't mean you weren't going to get a hit here and there. But modern day, how we haven't adapted so well is to that. And it's not that we need to be cold and just cut it all off and stuff it down. Obviously, we see how that's not beneficial. But more of the like, hey, you can feel that way. But then there is a time to, you know what, rise up, right? And so that's what your work is all about. I love that you share your story. We didn't even touch on your journey from your evolution from being a Jerusalem-born child of Orthodox parents to, middle-class American suburban youth. So there's so much in this book, Sit Down to Rise Up. Everybody grab a copy. What other final thoughts would you like to share with us as we exit this conversation? Although we could have 10 different ones just on some of the nuances of these points today.
Well, I do think I would like to just kind of, point out that we're living through obviously a really stressful, panic-inducing for many people, very real suffering time. And I think that so many people have been quick to feel hopeless and feel powerless and feel like, what can I do? And so what I want to leave people with is a really important kind of thought and proverb that I think people can put in their back pocket and think about when they feel like they're spiraling out of control and that they feel completely helpless to actually do anything to change the status of their community or the world or their city or, however big you want to take it. And that is, it's a beautiful Buddhist proverb that says that we should each tend to the area of the garden that we can reach. So you should tend to the area of the garden that you can reach. And essentially what that refers to is that, I think we all kind of want to swallow the ocean. And when we think about everything that's happening in the world, it is overwhelming. But if we can boil it down just to a couple of drops, and if we can look at our own garden, our own community of influence, the people that we come into contact with on a daily basis and can affect their lives, whether they're in our family or people we work with or the people we live next door to, how can we make sure that those people are okay? Can we focus on our own garden and tending to that garden? And if every single person did that, instead of looking at other people's, the neighbor's grass, so to speak, or thinking about, oh my God, look at this forest. It's too big. It's too overwhelming. I can't. And I think that the world can really be a much better place and that we can just restore the hope that we can change the lives of and improve the lives of, the people that are in our inner circle and thus create a ripples effect that we may not even live to see because they'll be so far reaching.
Beautiful. We will put everything to connect with Shelly in the show notes, but social media on Instagram, really easy. Mindful Skater Girl. Love that. Such a great handle. Thank you so much for your wisdom and for all that you've done and put out there in the world. It sounds like, some of those rough times seemingly were worth it for the greater good in this capacity. What came from it is lovely. So it's just wonderful. And everyone, you can visit her website and see everything that she has going on, and her books are on Amazon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Elle. I appreciate you.
You too. And for everyone else, we'll see you next week.
Hey, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this show, I would so appreciate you leaving a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And to learn more about partner discounts on amazing products, visit ellruss.com/discounts.